I've done lots of research on seed oils, so I can talk from my own research as well as all the evidence base that's out there. There is absolutely no evidence that is credible evidence when interpreted in the correct way to show seed oils are harmful.
There's no trials when you actually look at the hard endpoints and the real data. There's no studies that stand up to scrutiny that say seed oils are healthy. You got quite the reverse.
Coach Stephen, thank you for coming back on. Really appreciate you talking to us again.
Yeah, it's nice to see you, actually. I mean, I'm a consumer of your videos. I like your videos ever such a lot. So it's always nice to actually talk to you and be one of those content creators that gets onto your show, which is one of my favorites. I will be honest.
Oh, cheers. Thank you.
Okay.
I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the work you're doing. So just to talk about this, let me set this up. When I started doing Carnivore, one of the most surprising things for me was it's like my body had just been sitting there in suspended animation for years. And,
Yep.
kind of gradually deteriorating, wheels falling off. It's almost like, an old tin box, like, the ones you put the biscuits in, like an old tin box that's been lying out in the elements, it's just slowly deteriorating and rusting, And the most surprising thing for me was this suspended animation kind of thing and gradual deterioration. Then as soon as you start Carnivore, it's like your body goes, okay, I can wake up now. I know what to do. And I was just thinking, like, for the people you work with, what do you find are some of the most surprising things they come back with when they've just got started with Carnivore? Maybe they're a few months in.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say, one of the common themes, I don't want to start with such a negative thing, but they're always surprised in the main how much they've been lied to, which is not a nice thing to say. I know we talk about health and positives, but it is a thing that comes up continually, to the point that's why I ended up writing books, because I was sending out the same information so often, obviously regarding statins and LDL and all the normal things, and seed oils and all the misconceptions. But to talk about health, I'd rather talk about actually the sort of the positive outcomes. Because I've been doing this a long time, 15 years as a diabetic and obesity specialist practitioner, coming off their medications is always a big deal, because they've been told it's chronic, progressive, they'll be on these tablets for life. And they try Carnivore, and I still deal with people that just want to be keto and even some low carbers. And my first 5 years, I believed in the high carb stuff, which is how I can gauge that that's not successful, and what I do now is. And they're so shocked how quick it is, to be honest. Like you say, being in an old tin box, although I never really think about biscuits anymore, as you mentioned. I think it's surprise. I think the biggest thing is surprise that they can do it, and it's relatively simple after years of constantly dealing with different medications. Only yesterday I had somebody, you wouldn't believe the difference. She literally was on death's door. Her own words. Her kidney function was just in single figures. It was terrible. Now, she looked great. She's going to yoga, lost a ton of weight. Can't believe it. Now, even with all these brilliant and obvious improvements, our consultation yesterday was about medications they're offering. And get this, the first medication was to do one thing, and the second medication was to stop the side effects of the first one. And, that's paraphrasing it, but that's basically what was happening. And because in that particular case, what was happening was they were convinced that she still needed to get rid of lots of glucose, so they gave her a drug that literally makes you urinate out glucose. For that, you end up with candida and UTIs beyond belief. Well, the easiest thing to say is don't put the carbohydrates into your mouth in the first place. Simple as that. But she'd learnt that, and she's playing the game, sadly, because many people, I say, I still want your doctor on board. I still want you telling the doctor what you're doing, because it's really important to keep that relationship going, especially if you're on medications. But they now see through it. So it is a bit like having sort of the scales falling from your eyes, because you can't unsee the results that you can get from just lowering carbohydrates. And I think people think we're demonizing carbohydrates. Well, we're not. We're just being practical. If your body wants a teaspoon of sugar in 5 litres of blood on average, why would you put 9 teaspoons of sugar into your body, like by drinking a can of Coke?
Right.
It's ridiculous. Yeah, so obvious, isn't it?
And so this is actually, I think, is a really good example of part of this problem. The patient that, they're saying you have to get rid of the glucose, so we're going to give you tablets to do that. And it's like, okay, but hang on, as you say, we could do that, or we could just stop putting it in there in the first place. And this
Yeah,
is the same argument that people like Neil Barnard have about how, diabetes is caused by saturated fat. It's like the reason you get diabetes is because saturated fat is stopping the glucose going into the cells. And it's like, so you got to cut out the saturated fat. And it's like, well, hang on. Shouldn't we just cut out the glucose?
Yes, exactly.
Hmm.
I mean, that's, I think I call it sort of proxy marker syndrome, really, where they just assume one thing is the problem, and the easiest way to do it is to just lower that number with a medication. So that's allopathic medicine. In a nutshell, it isn't about what's causing the number. It's lower the number normally. Sometimes it's raising the number if it's like low iron or something like that. But again, that's normally down to not eating the right foods. So I think I suppose that's the biggest thing, that people just are well, firstly, they're surprised how simple it is, and secondly, how inexpensive it is, because they've been told to have, what was it the other day? I mean, there was something like 15 supplements were on offer. And I just went through the supplements and said, right, well, that's in meat, that's in eggs, that's in dairy if you want it, but you don't really have to have dairy. That you'll get that in liver if you want liver, but you don't have to have much of it. So you can go through every single supplement and say, or zinc is in oysters. It's fish oil is in fish. So it's like, just eat whole food. It's so obvious, and it is slightly frustrating, because you get the same old all the time, the same things. Even friends and family. Oh, my cholesterol is terrible. My doctor wants me on a drug. And then you have to go through the whole, well, what does that actually mean? And why is that? I even have people now saying to me, well, I got to 60 and I've got to go on a diabetic medication. And I said, oh, well, what happened with your blood test? Oh, I haven't had a blood test. The doctor just said I'm 60, so I should be on a diabetic medication. I mean, this is quite a startling new trend, which it's all just age related, not based on any symptoms whatsoever. And that person is particularly odd of that age group, because they're incredibly fit, remarkable. And I've seen their bloods, and they're not diabetic at all. So that actually could be very counterproductive, because their blood glucose management is great. You don't want to be lowering blood glucose without looking at their bloods. I actually can't believe that. I find that quite scandalous, actually.
And all the things, when you think about supplements and when you think about all these measurements, how did we survive before? Like, it's like the human race was fundamentally broken until companies were able to establish themselves to mass produce these powders and drugs. It makes no sense.
No, it doesn't make any sense. And I think, really, when you look at what's been said about the carnivore diet, for instance, well, I should have died 5 years ago, because I've had no fiber. So I don't exist. Sean Baker doesn't. Most of us just don't exist anymore. We've all died long, long time ago. So there's no, and we've all got scurvy. It's just, it beggars belief, because we've lost that connection with common sense. And sometimes, more often than not, when I talk to people and do these sort of things, yeah, you want to hear all the science, but in the end, it's all about common sense. Really, that's it. look at you. You look great. You're much more active. You've got a good sense of humour. You work really hard. You don't have a day off. I haven't had a day off for 10 years since I went low carb. I haven't had a day at the doctor's. I'm on no medications whatsoever, even though I'm 60. Well, I must be doing something right. I must be. It's really that simple. And then when, thank you for talking about the people I'm dealing with. I've had over 1,000 clients, and none of them have reported scurvy. Nearly all of them have reported body composition improvements, getting off their blood pressure medications, getting off their diabetic medications, reversing mental health problems, sleeping better, thyroid issues being resolved, kidney function. That's a big thing because, the biggest problem with kidneys in this world, actually, or Western world, is diabetes. It's diabetic complications really are causing the kidney problems. So once you deal with the diabetes, you end up fixing the kidney more often than not. So that I think it's very frustrating because, when you look at everything and you take a couple of sentences to say how ludicrous it is, people go, oh, yeah, that's interesting. We look at bird flu, right? Why does that only affect chickens? The thing that the globalists don't want you to eat. Why doesn't it affect other birds? So that's bird flu. Why is it just chickens? Methane, animals farting. Why is it only cows? Why is it not other animals?
Why is it not vegans?
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. Well, yes, that's a jokey sort of remark, but that's true. They produce a lot of gas out of both ends, by the way, and they do produce a lot of methane. So you can just take a step back and say, oh, well, hang on a minute. So bird flu is just chickens, methane's just cows. That makes no sense. That makes no sense. And then when you look at how many people are flying, and the people that are telling you about these emissions, they always own private jets and they're flying, left, right, and centre. I think Bill Gates, one flight of his was the same carbon footprint as my entire year, just one of his many, many private jet flights. So we know we're being lied to, and we know why we're being lied to. Money is always sort of or the love of money is the root of all evil. And, everyone that says anything like, for instance, about seed oils, you can always track the money. When you look at their studies, the authors are always conflicted. There's been a big thing with the diary of a CEO, Professor Sarah Berry on there, who, if you've seen her, she mentions all the conflicts of interest. She actually says it. She says, I'm funded, I need to declare my business interest. I am funded by the almond industry, was one of the things that she said. I've got a quote here. So I've spent many years comparing palm oil to other fats. I've actually received a lot of research funding from the palm oil industry. And I always like to declare any conflict of interest. And then when she mentions studies, yeah, they're full of conflicts of interest. The Zoe company, for instance, is huge. Don't be fooled by the fact that they try to be this sort of funky, friendly little company, little startup. They cashed in on their COVID symptom app. They got government funding. I think they raised like 2 million from the government. They had a government grant in August 2020, and ended up raising, I think, 75 million in the last couple of years, and another 15 million to try and get into the US. A lot of their studies that they reference, are backed by Unilever, which, as you know, is a major food processor. So, the way they sell themselves is this funky, great startup. We can do all these tests, which are very expensive, by the way, a monthly plan or something, I think £299. And yeah, they back it with the sort of pseudo-science. Yeah, we give you the continual glucose monitor. But look at that, your blood sugar's up. Well, just stop eating carbohydrates. Oh, no, that's not what we do. We send you all these different meal plans and, lots of fiber. It's And even that Diary of a CEO, he's invested in it, and I think in August 2024 he had to come clean because he wasn't making it clear. And you do need to be clear who's funding you. So I'm going to declare my interest. My conflict of interest is humans.
Right.
I like dealing with people.
So that's the thing, right? If thinking about especially that seed oil episode of the Diary of a CEO, like he's got interests, you know, in Zoe, was it? And she's got all her funding from different sources. It You need to know this thing. It's like listening to if someone was telling you about doing low carb and they were the biggest investor in some CGM company or something like that's an important piece of information you'd want to know because you'd want to be able to judge what they're really trying to get you to do. But
Yeah.
it's awful that, and she's just I didn't see much of it. I watched the bits that Lee Kent Carnivore had clipped out for his video, and she was just so kind of dismissive of anything that was like there's been no like seed oils are great, seed oils are wonderful. This is ridiculous. It's just so dismissive of anything else.
Yeah, and she contradicts herself because at the beginning when she talks about the fact that most diseases have started since the introduction of seed oils and the decrease in saturated fat, there's still been more heart problems. She said, well, this is epidemiology. It doesn't prove causation. So we can dismiss what we see with our own eyes and our common sense. And then the next 3 points, she uses epidemiology to prove causation. That's what so she does it. I mean, basically, she is very contradictory. Well, you can't say on one hand, the first criticism about seed oils, well, it's all epidemiology, and then the next 3 things we talk about, well, it's all epidemiology that proves it. That is rubbish, and you can see through it. I don't feel it's the studies she uses are very credible because, like I say, that they are all there were conflicts of interest, which are absolutely amazing. I mean, when there's a meta-analysis mentioned of 15 studies, only 4 of those actually use seed oils in the study. So, 11 didn't even do that. And I think, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was something like one of the studies, they tested 1 meal, just 1 meal. So they ate something once, and it's just absolutely amazing. And when you look at the worries about oxidation, for instance, I think that study had 19 men in it, and they were given a muffin which had sunflower oil in, and then they were given a muffin, believe it or not, where they fried the oil fried some potato chips 5 times a day for 10 days. So they were trying to prove the oxidation wasn't a problem. And they used a thing called flow-mediated dilation as the measure to prove oxidation. But that method doesn't even prove oxidation. That's to do with how blood vessels function. And it was only a 3-hour period afterwards they did the test. And anyone that knows about long-term health knows that it's long-term consumption of these things that causes a problem. I mean, both you and I don't really want to go out and eat a tub of Haagen-Dazs ice cream, but we could. We could do it. We wouldn't feel great, but it wouldn't prove very much. If we were trying to prove that that was harmful, 2 weeks later we'd be fine. So we could say, well, there's our study. Both Dave and I, long-term carnivores, had a tub of ice cream and a Coke. 2 weeks later, we were fine. Therefore, those 2 things are fine. You can't say that. You've got to have a long-term exposure. So.
Yeah, I mean, I always think that a lot of these studies that get pushed out, they do studies where they're going to get funding, and they're going to get funding for stuff that says seed oils are good, that ultra processed foods are good, and all this kind of thing, right? That's where the funding's going to come from. And the results to me always seem to be, like you said, they're so short, or so little number of people participating in it, or this looks like it was just luck that they got the result they got, kind of thing. It was like they did this for such a short period and they just went, oh, that's the result we're looking for, so let's stop it now. It just, it's all trash, but it just builds up and builds up and builds up, and there's so many of them, all pointing, of course, the way the funding wants it to point. So people just go, oh, well, it must be true.
Yeah, I mean, well, when you say luck, I think you're being very magnanimous there. I think it's designed to give the result they want to give, to be honest. When you look at, just look at any study really that is supporting these things, you can pick them apart all the time. I mean, like I say, the seed oil one that, what's her name, Professor Berry was mentioning, when you actually look at the studies, they are really pointless. And I'm going to do a thing with Lee, actually, who you mentioned later on today, looking at a tweet from Lane Norton. And it's just completely cherry-picked, completely and utterly devoid of any scientific integrity. And, the way he does the tweet is deliberately misleading. It isn't luck that he's arrived at a figure on one thing and dismissed another, which is about the I don't want to spoil Lee's video too much, but it's about the increase in fat in the liver when you compare saturated fat to to non-saturated fat. I mean, it doesn't prove anything. In fact, he's comparing fructose and saturated fat. Sorry, Lee, if you're watching, I don't want to give away too much, but he comes up with this figure of there's a 70% increase in liver fat. Well, actually, it isn't 70%. That's a relative risk. It's something like 1.4% compared to 2.7% is the actual increase. The absolute data is there. But what he also completely ignores, and this is really frightening, is the fructose group, with the one he's defending, the de novo lipogenesis, the production of new fat in the liver. There's nearly a tenfold increase compared to saturated fat. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. And that's also dismissed. And of course, when you're looking at liver fat, when you get liver fat from de novo lipogenesis with the fructose pathway, you also might have less hepatic triglyceride, which is the posh thing they're looking at, which just means fat in the liver, really, I suppose, to the layman. But what happens is it pushes it out, when it's the fructose pathway, it pushes it out as serum triglycerides. So even in the study, you can see, there is a slightly smaller accumulation of fat in the liver compared to saturated fat. By the way, it wasn't saturated fat that we eat; it was coconut oil. But there's a huge increase in fat in the blood. So it's just the way he wants to look at it, and the way he wants to manipulate the figures with relative risk rather than absolute risk, rather than looking at the whole study. And it's aimed at low carbers. Well, there's no low carbers in the group. There's no carnivores in the group. There's no saturated fat completely from animal sources. So he's having to go at low carbers with a study that doesn't have low carbers in it. Right. That doesn't have a complete, so that's what they all do. They all contradict themselves. They all cherry pick. They all are very dismissive of real science. So, like, going back to that seed oil thing, she's very dismissive of oxidization. She's very dismissive of the chemical process. So, for instance, olive oil. Why is olive oil, in my opinion, healthier than a seed oil? Well, the first thing is you can get an olive and you can squeeze it and you can get oil out. You don't need hexane. You don't need to heat it. You don't need chemicals. You don't need bleaching. You don't need deodorizing. That's pretty much the process that seed oils go through. They go through this horrible mechanical process. Now, she actually says in that conversation, well, the reason we go through this is because we want to maximize production. No, that's not my rationale. I want to maximize health. I don't want to. So basically, she's going straight. Her defense is making money. is maximizing production. It isn't maximizing health. And I find that when you actually sit back, and if you can manage to listen to it, I found it very difficult because she's so blasé, so unbothered about the truth, really obviously defending her financial interests. And sorry to be so sort of aggressive about this, but it's frustrating because you're dealing with people's health. There's no actual science there, just defending it. And if you're going to use epidemiology for three things, then you've got to accept the massive epidemiology that health issues have started in association with the rise in seed oils. Right. So you either accept that you're going to use epidemiology to try and back up your thing, or don't. But you can't use two mechanisms. I mean, we never do. On the low carb, keto, and carnivore side, I think most people, I don't know every influencer, so there might be some other people doing these sort of disingenuous practices, but we like the facts. We just say these are the facts. This is the study, and these are the flaws with it. These are the limitations. But in the end, nothing beats clinical experience. So going back to your original question, sorry, it's a very long answer, but when you see people getting better time and time again, I don't need a study. I really don't need a study, because I know what we're doing is right, and I know what I used to do personally, and what people come to me, what they are doing is wrong, because it's got them into the state that they're in. And that's, I think, why I'm a little bit cross about the way the Diary of a CEO has gone, because it's misleading and it's not helping people's health. That's the same with Lane Norton's disingenuous tweets. Put the facts out there, mate. Don't cherry pick. Don't change absolutes to relative risk when it suits you, and use absolutes when it suits you. Don't. It's all wrong. You've got to be consistent. So I always look at absolute numbers. Always use that. So what that means to people is, if you've got 100 people and a tablet helps, two of them, and those without a tablet, only one gets better. Yeah, well, that the absolute risk improvement is 1%, but it's always produced as twice as many people were saved by the tablet, because 2 is twice as much as 1. Well, twice as many sounds really good, but 1% doesn't. That's down to chance. And they do this all the time.
Yeah. So you hit on a few things there that I'd love to get your kind of explore a little more and get your opinion on. One of them was when you talk about like the production process of the seed oils and like using hexane and bleaches and things like that, right? A lot of the doctors out there that will defend seed oils, and I guess this lady as well that was defending it, they'll say things like, well, there are studies that show that canola oil is heart protective, right? And I always think when they say that, all right, well, the next time you're eating an apple, before you eat the apple, give it a wipe with hexane to clean it off and eat the apple. Would they do it? They wouldn't do it.
No.
So, like, again, these studies, like, how can it actually, unless again it's chance or it's designed in a particular way, how can it be showing that kind of stuff is heart protective?
Well, because it isn't. Like I say, it's cherry picked, and they don't show you the studies that don't answer the question. They don't use that. Like I say, that one that was looking at oxidization. I think out of the 15 studies, like I say, I think only 4 of them actually use seed oils. So, yeah, but when you go back, when science was possibly conducted in a more robust manner, if you look at the Minnesota Coronary Study, which is 1968 to 73, that actually looked at a difference between polyunsaturated fat and saturated fat. And those that were eating the polyunsaturated fat had worse cardiovascular outcomes than the control group. That was, the infamous study that was hidden for 16 years. You can look it up now. Interestingly, there was a lead author on that called Ansel Keys. I don't know if you've heard of him. But anyway, that's actually a really well conducted study. you know, and but even that, it wasn't just flat out seed oils. It was margarine and shortenings. We used the shortenings we used as a source of saturated fat. So it's okay. There are many studies, and I just name checked that one, and the Sydney Diet Heart study was another one. That was again ended in 1973, and they were using safflower oil and polyunsaturated margarine. So it 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 really doesn't test sort of what you're trying to look at, especially with our way of eating. It doesn't really look at seed oils compared to saturated fat, because there were no carnivores in those days. And the study that Professor Sarah Berry mentioned was it's Sarah, isn't it? That was very short term, and it's just full of cherry picking and just making sure that they get the results that they want. And incredibly, whenever you look at studies, the older studies are definitely better. The diet and reinfarction trial, which is called the DART trial, 1989, that was another one that looked at polyunsaturated fat consumption, and it lowered cholesterol. So this is where the proxy marker comes in, because if you assume lowering cholesterol means you have less heart attacks, then that was a plus. And that's how they frame it. Polyunsaturated fat consumption, lower cholesterol. And then they make that leap. Well, therefore, they're going to have less cardiovascular events. But that isn't what actually happens when you do a long-term study, which is where the duration of the study is important, because when you look at hard health outcomes, which is dying, which you can't fudge, there's no difference, because there was no difference in ischemic heart disease between the experimental group and the control group. Again, even though there was lower cholesterol. So going back to one of the interviews I watched you do with Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, the writer of The Clot Thickens, that's the bottom line. Lowering cholesterol. Yeah, a statin lowers cholesterol. And they say, it does what it says then. It does do what it claims to do. Yes, it does. It lowers cholesterol. But the way it's sold is it claims to lower heart disease, but it doesn't. Or it stops you dying.
Their framing is completely wrong.
Yes.
Intentionally wrong.
Absolutely. Yes. And even when you look at I can't remember the last one. The rose corn oil trial, I think it's called. The same thing, exactly the same thing. You get the same results. You had 80 patients with disease, we've already had heart disease, and some had olive oil and some had corn oil. So, all right, again, what I was trying to say, it's not an animal fat, but it's a different type of fat. The control group did better than the corn oil group. So the olive oil did better than the corn oil. All right. So there's no trials when you actually look at the hard endpoints and the real data. There's no studies that stand up to scrutiny that say seed oils are healthy. You got quite the reverse. And I would say older studies are more interesting because they weren't industry funded, or they weren't so conflicted. They did actually want to find out these results. Like I say, the one that Ansel Keys was the lead author on, that was hidden for 16 years because the results were so damning. Well, but at least they did the study and they found it out. The frightening thing about that is they didn't make it public. So we know that the study wasn't done for people's health. It was done to try and prove a point, and when it didn't, they hid it. And I just find that incredibly I think that's near to fraud, actually, and it should be illegal to do that, because you are putting people's health at risk. So when you look at other things that are studied, certain things we can't still mention on YouTube, and we look at safety trials, there's never a placebo-controlled group. There's never a placebo-controlled group, because allegedly it's unethical to have one group not get the medication that they're testing. because the medication is good. They've already decided it's so good, we can't deprive anyone of it. That's their defense, which is
That makes no sense. How can that even be an argument?
And well, that's one particular class of medications which we're not allowed to talk about.
Right.
Never ever had a placebo-controlled safety trial ever, and they've used ethics as their little loophole to say, well, we know this is going to work. We can't ethically deprive the other group of the efficacy of this medication. We can't give them a placebo because that's not ethical. Did you not
But
know this,
that's
Dave?
like, no, I didn't. And that's like
Mm.
they're twisting themselves into a pretzel to make it sound like it's unethical. And it's just like, well, no, they can do the trial and then they can have the medication. Like, what's the big
Yeah.
deal?
Yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? It's absolutely terrible. That's one class of medication. Most medications are tested against placebo, proper control groups, but we won't get into that too much. But that's what that big deal is about, and it's all this mental gymnastics. I think is actually a phrase that Professor Berry used. There's a lot of mental gymnastics to make these things. No, we're the group that's talking about common sense and what we're observing and what we're seeing in populations. We're seeing the increase in all these chronic illnesses, and we want to know why. And when you take a bold step back, you can say, right, okay, what changed in 1977? What changed in the 80s? And you can look at many things. Now, yeah, I'm not actually saying epidemiology works, because I could say to you, well, actually, the rise in diabetes is because postage stamps prices have gone up. All right. Well, you probably would see quite a collinearity. You would probably see those graphs, and that's ridiculous. But on a sort of a huge population scale, what is the most common thing that you could think of? Well, I think it's low-fat diet guidelines came in. Maybe that. Maybe the consumption of sugar, but we do see that the sugar consumption has dropped off recently and plateaued, but seed oil consumption hasn't. That's increased and increased and increased and increased. And there are really good graphs. I mean, I might send you one. I don't know if you want to overlay it, where you can quite clearly see that there does seem to be some sort of, association. But like I say, you can't say one thing is good and one thing isn't. You can't use that. So the only thing I would say is, because epidemiology is used so much, it is the only thing we can talk about. But you can't dismiss it, for one thing and then use it for three things. It's,
Yeah, you've either got to accept all of it or none of it. You can't
Yeah.
can't be straddling the fence, right?
Yeah. So when you talk about interventional studies, which is the ones I mentioned there, that's meaningful, because everything else is allegedly controlled. I mean, I wasn't there. I don't know how tight the regulations were, but that's an interventional experimental study. It's actually saying, right, we're going to give one person or one group this and the other group that, and we're going to see what happens. But even that can sort of backfire if you're not fat adapted, for instance. If it's not, the trial isn't long enough, there isn't enough people. So there is a lot to be said for the fact that nutrition science is an oxymoron. A bit like, Microsoft Works.
That's a good one. I never thought of that. And all the time I've used products like that, I've never thought of that. That's a good one.
So yeah, I think the public are waking up, and that's the other thing. And the week before the seed oil Diary of a CEO episode, we had Georgia Reed on there, who was talking about keto, and she was being brilliant, as she always is. And when they got to fiber, the interviewer said, well, what about fiber? I mean, fiber is good because it lowers blood sugar spikes. And she just said, well, where does the spike come from? Looping back to the original part of our conversation, he was a bit like, from the glucose you're eating. You could see in his face, well, If you don't eat the glucose, you don't need the fiber to dampen that spike. So it's all about looking at the root cause and thinking, what's the common sense here? What is the common sense? If you did it as a cartoon, I haven't got the money to do these sort of animations, but I'd love to do a sort of animation of someone just stuffing sugar, bread and pasta and rice into their mouth and getting a little bit fatter, and a little illustration of the blood glucose going up and up and up. And just having the question, how do you stop the blood glucose going up? Well, you stop this bit. I mean, it's really that simple. And you could have someone next to them eating chicken and, a ribeye or some eggs and stuff, and their blood glucose not going up. And you could say, what is that person doing that the other person isn't doing? What's the difference? Well, the answer is the high levels of carbohydrates, which was why, when I started in the specialism of diabetes and obesity, they didn't want patients to have glucose monitors. They did not want them to have control. And I can remember being told, well, they won't listen to us. Well, yeah, they won't, because they'll know the truth.
Right.
Terrible, really.
But honestly, when you talk about the putting those things in front of people and saying, what's the problem here? It just makes me think, it's so ridiculous and so convoluted, and there's so much mental gymnastics involved in all of nutrition science that honestly, if there was a stand-up comedian that wanted new material, there's a 2-hour special in this stuff, because it's just so ridiculous.
It is, and but it's dressed up in such a way, and also, again, I'll reference Lane Norton. It's so aggressive and so arrogant. You think, well, maybe he's got a point. He's very, very confident. To me, it's overconfidence. I think in that tweet, he says something like, what do you think of that, low carbers? You'll be quiet about this one, as if it's like a really compelling study when, it's behind a paywall. Now, if people want to send me some money and support me and buy me a coffee or something, I'd really appreciate it. Because every time I see a study, it's behind a paywall. It costs me about £40 to go and see it. So all those studies, it's expensive to look at. And I think that's part of the reason that people don't pull him up so much, because you can't see the details. So, for instance, you can go and look at a sort of précis of it on PubMed, but it doesn't really tell you what they were eating. So, for instance, that's how I found out. Well, they were eating, they weren't eating animal saturated fats. They were eating, coconut oil. So that's not an animal fat. Okay, and there's different types of saturated fat as well. And then you find out they're all eating a background meal. There's an overfeeding study, which is, so there's a plot hole in it really straight away, because overfeeding anything is going to cause you to have a problem. You can have too much water. That's going to cause you a problem. Doesn't mean water's bad. So how many low carbers do you know that would have over 200 grams of carbs as a background meal and then be overfed? So what's that showing you? It's just showing you that a mixed macro diet is not particularly good. The weird thing is about that study is it was also sort of trying to frighten people off and say that, if you think fructose is bad, saturated fat is really bad. Well, what it actually proved, that study, is fructose is really bad. So it didn't really do anything other than that, because, de novo lipogenesis, like a tenfold increase. That's the making of new fat in your liver. That's huge. Compared to saturated fat, 10 times increase. Wow. Thanks for that study that you were using against us, because it actually defeats the whole point. What you need in that sort of study is a low carb group eating an animal saturated fat, or a low carb group that are getting saturated fat and not doing a mixture of like butter.
But then
I think
they'll never do that though, because they'll be worried about the results not going the way they want them to go, right?
Yeah, well, that's what I was looping back to, your phrase luck. That isn't luck. That is designed to give the result they want. They want to show that fructose is allegedly not as bad. So their measure was intrahepatic triglycerides, not de novo lipogenesis. But I'll give them their credit. They mentioned it. They also mentioned serum triglycerides going up with the fructose group. Well, there's the nuance. So if you're a proper scientist, you don't do that tweet, or you do a tweet that mentions all of those things. And then you say to Nick, or steal Nick Norwitz's phrase, you need to stay curious, because there is possibly things you could take from that study. I actually don't think it's particularly well designed, because most studies are overfeeding overfeeding studies, which the name tells you straight away. You're overfeeding. You are going to get a reaction. And it doesn't get into, the possibility that it's eliciting the Randall cycle, cross inhibition of glucose and fat metabolism. There's so many nuances to it. I will thank him, because it's an interesting study to look at, and it's also a great study to use as an example of how not to talk about a study. So that's what Lee and I are going to do tomorrow. We're going to go through that tweet just line by line and say, he's got it wrong.
Yeah, but so you bring up a good point about Lane Norton specifically, that he'll go on shows like Diary of a CEO, and he'll go on other podcasts, and his tweets and whatever, and he speaks so authoritatively about stuff. The average person would go, yeah, he's probably got a point. And it's this constant seeding of doubt as well that is just makes people go, I don't know what to do. I'm just gonna stick with my regular diet.
Yeah, and I think if you look at his facial expressions, he knows what he's doing. You can actually see. I mean, when you look at clips, he's on shaky ground. He knows he's on shaky ground, but he bluffs it out. If someone has that confidence, it's just repeating the lie and repeating it and bluffing it out until people say, well, that must be true, because I keep hearing that, and they're so certain it must be true. And that's a tactic. That is a known tactic. And it's very frustrating, because if you've got the money to get the studies, and you just sit and read it, and you don't have to be a scientist to read it. It's pretty straightforward. You just bore yourself for a half an hour by just going through it and looking at simple things like, firstly, were the groups compatible? Is it like for like? And if for instance it's aimed at low carbers, is there a low carb group in there? Is there a ketogenic group in there? Is there a carnivore group in there? All right, so this isn't really applicable to me. If a 60-year-old man, if I wanted to know about my health, I wouldn't read a study about 20-year-old females, because it's not applicable to my situation. If I want to know about carnivore, I'm not going to read a study that doesn't have a carnivore in it and think, oh, this is applicable to me, because it isn't. Again, it's just common sense. So you have to look at the study and think, right, okay, well, it doesn't really fit the people he's aiming at the tweet, but I will still look at the study because maybe I can learn something from it. And then just look at what they're eating. And it will make your eyes roll. It really will. Like I say, that one that Professor Berry was talking about, where they just put seed oil into a muffin. Well, what about the muffin? There's sugar in the muffin. There's gluten. There's so many things in that could also be a confounder. And then frying potato chips for 10 days, 5 times a day, proving that doesn't oxidize it. Well, did the test actually look at oxidization? Well, no, it didn't. So, and you can learn it. You can absolutely learn it, because if you see a phrase, let's say you see a phrase and you have no idea what that phrase means, you could go to the old advertising platform, Google, which is just an advert delivery system. And you could type in that phrase and say, what does that phrase mean? And you might be lucky, and they might actually give you an answer rather than an advert. So if you look up flow mediated dilation and put in, does this test for oxidization? Even Google will say, no, it doesn't do that. So you can do it yourself. You don't have to believe me or you or Lane or Sarah Berry or whatever her name is. Do the research yourself. Research, the name is searching again, researching. That's it. So you don't have to have a PhD to read a study and find out about it. You can do it. And I tell you, the power is completely taken away from everyone. You could even look, if I'm saying something, I guarantee everything I've said is what's in that study, because I'm not trying to do hyperbole and rhetoric. I'm just telling you what's in there. You could look at every study and go, right, that doesn't make any sense, because that's not what the study's saying. Or it's only 6 people. Wow, for 2 weeks. What's that going to really tell us about long-term health outcomes? Nothing. So, sorry, a bit of a rant there, but I want people to be empowered to do their own studies and actually understand where all these things are coming from.
Mm. So you mentioned that, previous decades ago, the studies they were doing, they were actually looking for the real answer. Whereas, as we know now, the studies, they're designed to get a particular result, and the people that funding it want to get that result. Do you think that's ever going to improve, or
No,
it behooves the individual to understand a little bit about what they're seeing?
no, it's not going to improve, because there's too much money in it. The legacy media are in on it, the NHS is in on it, everybody's in on it for the money. They're not in it for health. We can see that when I think it was Goldman Sachs wrote to one of the pharmaceutical companies over their diabetic medication, which was actually quite efficacious. They actually said, this is a really bad business model because you're helping people. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what a public domain, a record, which you can look up, said. You need to not do this drug because it is helping too many people, and it's not good business. So and that's another thing. I mean, company law. If you are a shareholder, right, your company's written in law that the company has to do its best to make you a profit. So, again, it's all written in stone. So a pharmaceutical company's first first principle is to make its shareholders money. It's not to cure people. So I'm not giving them a free pass. I'm just saying that's the law. I mean, that's it. You can look that up. Again, you can hopefully use a proper search engine to find these things out. But they're in business. It's the pharmaceutical business, the pharmaceutical industry. If you look at the climate change rubbish, all the nonsense about that, I think the pharmaceutical industry is responsible for 29% of the emissions, greenhouse emissions. I think hospitals and pharmaceuticals
More than cows.
Oh yeah, by about 20 times, something like that. It's incredible. It's incredible because it's deflected, because people think, oh, well, they're just making tablets. But of course, it's petrochemical, it's huge industrial plants. And if you look at anything, you follow the money. It's frightening, really. I'd love to say to you, yeah, I think that's all going to change and science is going to win out. Citizen science is where it's at. It's people that are interested in health and taking it into their own hands. So someone like Nick Norwitz and Dave Feldman are doing it, which is why the sort of high carb, high fiber advocates don't like them. Is because they are saying, well, we've got enough private individuals that want to know the answers. They don't want cherry-picked, deliberately designed studies that are going to show a certain outcome. We want to actually study this stuff, and we want to study it so it's relevant to the people that we're talking about. And that's it. I mean, many years ago, I do think, maybe I'm being naive, but the studies do seem to be better designed, or maybe there was less plastic food around, so they couldn't manipulate it as much. But I think this is one of the things. Whenever you look at anything in detail, you start to see the modern world has intervened and made a big balls up of it, really. So even this thing about tallow, and I think it's Steak and Shake using tallow to fry their French fries. There was another company that said they're going to use tallow, but when you actually look at the tallow has a chemical in it that's been added for whatever reason, I think to deodorize it. Well, that defeats the object. The whole point of using tallow is it's natural. So don't put a chemical in it. And it's it's heartbreaking, because all you want to do is make people healthy in the end. And I would really like proper studies that tell me something that is about human health. And like I say, I mean, Ansel Keys was criminal, but he did that one study that I mentioned earlier, and I think it was quite well designed. Well, it was so well designed and so impartial. They hid it for 16 years. And it wasn't revealed because somebody had a bit of conscience about it. It was because an investigative reporter decided to try and find out about it and then put it public. So it wasn't in the public for the public health's sake. It was there because, it was good journalism, really. So, I mean, I do have tons and tons of studies I can send. If people want to see the studies, I can send, a PDF about it if you want. But the best thing is to use your eyes and ears and your own experience.
Mm.
You can experiment with food yourself. You can use a continual glucose monitor. You can watch lots of success stories. I mean, what's my conflict of interest? I don't have any funding. No, I have no brand on any of my videos. I don't get paid to do a video at all. The people that come and do success stories, they have nothing to sell. Nothing. They just come and say, thanks, Stephen, for helping me. My kidney function was down to 5. I was given 2 weeks to live, and now look at me. I'm really healthy. I'm off my I've lowered my blood pressure. I'm off those meds. I'm off my diabetic meds. The world is my oyster, and that's it. I mean, it's really simple. It's really simple. Just eat the food we're meant to eat, and don't eat the foods that have been chemically altered and designed in such a way to make them hyper palatable, and you be completely hooked on them and dependent, because that's what makes those companies lots of money. They want you to be sick. They want you to be addicted. They want you to crave. They want you to keep eating these things. And they're winning because you get ridiculous people like Professor Berry defending them because they've got a vested interest. And it's just completely and utterly shambolic. I mean, it's not about health at all. Not about health at all.
Yeah, but that's good advice. Just eat real food, and if it requires a nutrition label, you should be suspicious of it, I think, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like I said about the medications. That person was offered one and then another one to deal with the side effects. Well, that's a red flag, surely, straight away. I'm trying to make myself healthy, and yet you're giving me something that's going to fix one thing, allegedly, but make other things bad. So I need another medication to fix those bad side effects. And then, if you look at the patient insert of anything, you can reverse engineer it to see, right, that actually isn't in the long term going to help me. So if you look at like blood pressure, a lot of people think it should be this one size fits all, 120/80, which again is so ridiculous. Why should a 19-year-old female athlete have the same blood pressure as a 60-year-old sedentary content creator? Well, no, we're going to have different needs. Our arteries are going to be different, and there's going to be more stiffening in the arteries, and it's all about delivery of the blood, isn't it? And you want oxygen and nutrients to the brain. Well, blood pressure plays that role. It increases the volume of your blood to make sure that you have enough oxygen. So when you look at a blood pressure medication insert, which lowers your blood pressure, what are the side effects? Lightheadedness, dizziness, fatigue, brain fog, the danger of fainting. Well, that's because you are reducing the oxygen and the entry of blood to your brain, in a disproportionate manner. I'm not telling people to stop their blood pressure medication. I'm just saying if you do the joined up thinking and use the insert, right, okay, so I need to be where I need to be with my blood pressure. There is a reason. It's a response. If I said, Dave, do your blood pressure now, then go and run up the stairs, back down, up, down, up, down, up, down, and then do your blood pressure. What's it going to be? It's going to be higher because it's demand driven. Absolutely. If I said, well, fall asleep for the next half an hour, I'm going to waffle on a bit more, your blood pressure will go down. And it's a response. So we need to get back into being a bit more realistic about that. And when you look at the insanity of the Joint National Committee, which I think the iteration now is like 9 or 10 or something. They meet every so often to work out the level of blood pressure, what should be the guidelines. It's never mandatory, by the way, but the pharmaceutical industry and the doctors always look at the guidelines as well. That works for us. We can sell more tablets, basically. So when it was lowered to 120/80, that brought in a huge amount of patients. Really did. More people could be prescribed meds. Notice I never said that it helped people actually get healthier. When you look at the recommendations, they are just that. This is guidance. It's not mandatory. It's not for every patient. It should be individualized. It actually says that, but that's all ignored. And then they brought in one which was 115/75. That was the Joint National Committee's thing. Now, that was retracted because anecdotally, many people were fatigued and having brain fog and dizziness and all those sort of things. They denied that it was anything to do with the clinical outcomes, but they retracted that about 4 years later, and did mention in that publication that it was to stop those things being potential problem. So I think they did acknowledge that it happened, because they wouldn't have actually raised them back up. And that's when they also brought in the much higher, which is a pejorative statement, but a more realistic guidelines for older people, where I think it was 139 or something like that. Might even be 159 if you were 60. So where's that? Where's the common sense in the media talking about blood pressure? No, it's nowhere. It's all 120/80, even though that's arbitrary, incorrect, and not individual. Even though the committee does actually say it should be, but it's easier to just say 120/80. It seems to work, and we can prescribe medication. So I get people. Wow, this is a 60-minute answer to one question. So I get people coming to me saying, "Oh, my blood pressure is really, really high. It's 135 over, let's say 135/95." I'm like, yeah, okay. What's the symptoms? Do you have any symptoms? Now, a lot of people say, well, it's a silent killer. But there's no actual proof of that. And in the old days, you used to have a checklist of 10 things that were symptoms of high blood pressure. So it's really difficult to actually just tell people, well, maybe that's the blood pressure you need at the moment. What is your heart rate? Because then you talk about blood volume. What's the pulse pressure? What's the difference between the top and bottom number? And it's nuanced. I'd never say to somebody, oh, well, okay, you do need a tablet because 120/80 is what you need to be, because that's not true. There could be a reason that it's slightly higher. Again, I don't like the word higher, but, it is. Millimeters of mercury higher, it is. It's a fact. What if the pulse rate is lower? Does that mean that the heart is really efficient? So they, the actual volume of blood is still controlled, but in a different way, by lowering the heart rate, bringing up the pressure a bit. So I think when we look at all of these things, there's no real good science. There is pockets of it. Like I say, the Joint National Committee does actually sound okay, but the way it's talked about isn't, because it's all cut down, paraphrased, and it's all, bite-sized stuff rather than looking at nuance. People haven't got time to sit with, a 60-year-old guy and say, right, well, your blood pressure is a little bit high. Can we find out the reason? It's easier. And obviously, insurance-wise and standard duty of care-wise, it's easier to go, right, we need it down to 120/80. Here's a prescription.
Yeah, because the nuance, finding out what the problem is, and the nuance of talking to them about, is this diet? Is this something else? Is this stress related? What is it? There's a lot less money in that.
Yeah. And there's no money in not being on medications and eating the right food. And it's just very frightening to me that these people can do tweets, or they can go on a podcast and literally just be so dismissive of actual health outcomes. I really find that quite difficult.
Right. So, Stephen, how can people reach out to you and find out more about the work that you're doing, and find you online?
Well, as you can see, the ukcarnivore.com is the website. By the way, I've just looked that up. It was the Joint National Committee 8 report. And for people over 60 years old, the target was eased to 150 over 90. That's official. You can look that up. Suggests a new standard for older adults, published in 2014. There you go. So you could look that up if you think. Anyway, right. The website, ukcarnivore.com, is there. Coach Stephen on YouTube. Hopefully, Dave will put a link to my YouTube channel. I do have an app, which you can find on the Google or App Store, which you just type in the Carnivore Experience, and you should find me. And also have a school group, a community group with Richard Smith, the UK's top nutritionist. And that is the low carb school, because we try to be inclusive. So that's for people who are interested in low carb, keto, and carnivore. It's full of things like this. We offer 9 courses as well, included in the price. It's less than $10 a month, and it's a really thriving community with loads of free ebooks, all the stuff I talk about, all the studies. We do a live question and answer session on a Monday night for an hour, and we also do one on Sunday for half an hour after our completely free YouTube live, which we do every Sunday at 7 p.m. all across state-controlled Britain. 7 p.m. UK time, and that's an hour. So, and that's on YouTube.
Awesome. I'll link to all those below. Stephen, I really appreciate you coming back on and sharing your experience. It's really good to get your insights.
Thank you. No, it's a pleasure. And like I say, I think I'm a consumer. You're one of the best people out there. I like your content. So it's really nice to come on. And you have some wonderful people that follow you. The comments are really, in the main, very nice about me. So it's a pleasure. And I do try to read all the comments. It's just very difficult because Dave's so popular. There's hundreds and hundreds of comments.